Hey, welcome back. And today I want to talk about podcast. Yeah, you may heard a lot about podcast recently. And it's really an emerging market, podcasting market, and it's just a relatively new market. And it's due to the uh, kind of wireless headphones and mobile phones that people are really used to use this audio input, either like you're driving, you're commuting, you're doing some other thing like cooking, doing some housework, you will just turn on your podcast. So it's emerging, and but the problem is, so far I see is the solutions for hosting podcasts or like podcast platforms are really, I would say, crappy. I would say crappy. I use so many different platforms, and I find none of them are good. For example, the biggest problem I see so far is discoverability. If I just find it super hard to search podcast. That in fact, there's a search feature. There's always a search bar in any podcast platform, but the search bar just doesn't work that well. And imagine when you are browsing YouTube videos, there are so many different recommended videos on the sidebar. But when you're listening to the podcast, there's really lacking that kind of recommendation features. Even they do, but it's just crappy. So discoverability is really an issue. So that's why I feel most people only listen to those super podcasts, uh, those super famous podcasts. It doesn't just like a YouTube. Even very small YouTubers can be searched. Small YouTubers traffic actually comes from search. Um, it's not from the YouTube recommendation. But in the podcast, it's just pretty hard to search the new podcast. And even you search, you'll probably not really click in because to evaluate a podcast, the quality of podcast, really takes longer time than YouTube videos. Usually people watch 10 seconds of your YouTube video to decide if they want to watch more. But for the podcast, it's really hard to do that. You must listen for more than 10 minutes to really judge if this podcast is your cup of tea or not. So podcasts discoverability is really a problem. I think the problem comes from UI, comes from the nature of podcasts, and also because of the nature of podcasts is different from videos. That's why we need a new UI. We don't really have the UI they optimize for podcasts yet. So I do look forward to someone building that. And another thing is due to the nature of podcasts, usually you're doing some other thing when listening to your podcast, and you listen on your mobile phone for most time. And that's why people are usually for at least listen one podcast for quite a long time before they really tune out. On YouTube, if you can have over 5 minutes watch time, is considered doing very well for one video. But for podcast, the average listening time is definitely longer than that. I don't have the data at hand, but I believe it's over 10 minutes. It's easy to have over 10 minutes. If there's good podcasts, people usually listen at least 80% of the podcasts. They could be 1 hour, 2 hours. So the duration of and the kind of the attention of the audience paying to the podcast is really longer than videos, really longer than YouTube. And that's maybe there's opportunity because the engagement of users in podcast may be higher. But you could argue that when people listening to podcasts, they are maybe doing some other things like jogging, doing some other things like cooking. But that's if you consider these both effect, the average duration, the average attention, maybe podcast is higher. It's just my feeling, and that could be verified. And I do not see this kind of research being done so far, but yeah, maybe shown in the future. So there are two observations I found out so far for podcasting, And there are definitely more, and which I will cover in the next few videos. And if you would like to receive more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. And other than that, I will see you next time.